So first of all, let's speak to Elliot Keck, who's head of campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance. Elliot.
Good evening, Petrie.
Good evening, Elliot. Good to talk to you. Listen, when you look at the numbers, when you look at the numbers of people weekly now asking for PIP, people who are going off sick, the economically inactive, it is not difficult to see why Rishi Sunak would be thinking in this way, is it?
Yeah, you touched on a couple of things that I found really interesting. First was the cost of the reform, and any reform of such a fundamental nature has to be carefully thought through to ensure that you don't end up with an even worse system at the end. And we've seen that on many occasions. But I think the other thing you touched on was the fact it is unsustainable, and it is unsustainable. We're expecting PIP payments to double over the course of about 2019 to 2029 to £30 billion, 4 million people receiving these payments. So I think the government is absolutely right to be trying to get a grip on this.
But the question is always how, isn't it? Because if you means test things, or you have to have people go through various assessments to make sure that they're not swinging the lead, then you've got those, I mean, I say unforeseen costs. They come off a different budget, and you can happily say, oh, we've got the PIP budget down, but then it's several billion somewhere else on getting that bill down. That's the issue, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But listen, from my perspective and from the perspective of the Taxpayers Alliance, we don't believe that any benefit should be unconditional. We believe that if a taxpayer is going to help fund your living arrangements, then there should be a clear case that you need it. And I think it's really interesting. One of the things that hasn't been discussed yet is whether or not PIP payments should be means tested. At the moment, no matter your income, no matter your savings, you can receive these payments. And I understand these payments are for genuine living costs. But actually, if you earn a very, very high salary and you have high savings, is it really appropriate that taxpayers are funding those additional living costs?
Because, to explain, PIP is on top of, it's separate from unemployment benefit. It's separate from that. So you can be earning and still apply for a PIP payment. Elliot, what do you think about the situation, though, where is this really the fault of the individuals claiming this? We know there's a mental health crisis, at least we're told that all the time. We know there isn't the support that people need within the mental health NHS, that, you know, that people are languishing, if you like, with these forms of anxiety and depression, which only get worse. They don't get better on their own. Are we too quick to sort of point at people and say, you're just, you know, scamming the system, you've only got mild anxiety?
Yeah, I think absolutely we should avoid blaming individuals. This is a problem of the system. One of the proposals, for example, is that those with mild conditions, mild disorders, receive additional treatment instead of additional money. Now, that seems like an obvious solution, and it's shocking, frankly, that that solution isn't already in place. One of the other solutions is that these costs are paid up front. I think that is also interesting, given a lot of the additional costs do come up front. So it's certainly not about blaming individuals. Ultimately, if you create an incentive structure to claim money for what are, in most cases, very real conditions, then people will understandably claim that benefit. But we do need to look at fundamental reform to it.
But is that, the point I'm getting to, is that linked to, I mean, it's a chicken and egg situation, but is it linked very much to the NHS failing? Or do you think that this was going to happen? I can't help but think that people got used to getting free money during COVID, and that is now in the zeitgeist, if you like. That's now in the public consciousness, is that, okay, I can get free money, which does allude to the fact that I believe that some people, not all, but some, are swinging the lead. Because it's unquantifiable. If you say you have mild anxiety or you have anxiety or depression, there is no proof structure for that.
Yeah, and listen, you touched on the pandemic and how it meant that people became used to free money from the government. Of course, that's taxpayers' money in reality. But it also meant actually that we locked teens, people in their 20s, in their 30s, into their houses and flats for an illness that was highly unlikely to harm them for months and months and months. You couple that with an NHS waiting list crisis, and I think there really are people that are really, really struggling with mental health conditions that may not have been absent the pandemic. But also at the same time, I think it is clearly the case that we do possibly slightly overindulge mild conditions, which maybe we didn't a number of years ago, particularly when these payments were set up. So I think, listen, there are many, many different reasons behind the explosion in these payments, but it's right that the government are looking at getting those down.
I suppose what I'm going to is the fact, when PIP was able to be paid for mental health issues, because it used, I mean, PIP is fairly new, but you know what I mean, the disability benefits, that when mental health issues got parity with physical health issues, which a lot of people do agree with, and I do agree with, because I know people with severe mental health disabilities who couldn't work. But this is then if we repaired the NHS, do we think that these people would go back to work? I suppose that's what I'm asking.
Well, listen, that's a really difficult question. We know that the number of people who are on long-term sick has increased from 2.1 million to 2.5 million. We need to make sure that work is genuinely pays, and the record high tax burden, the fact that thresholds are frozen, does mean that work doesn't pay as well as it used to. The fact that we hammer businesses with extraordinarily high business taxes mean that they're not offering the salaries that they would normally. So again, this is not about blaming the individual. Unfortunately, the government has created a system, it's created a benefit system and a taxation structure that has meant that it has become increasingly financially desirable to stay out of work.
Yeah, we've got a growing percentage, haven't we, of young people, but as you mentioned earlier, who were the ones that were locked down, as you say, completely unnecessarily, it would seem now, but that they're the young people who are not entering into the workplace in the first place. So when the Taxpayers Alliance looks at a story like this and quite rightly points out that this burden on the taxpayer is not sustainable, is there a version of the world that the Taxpayers Alliance can see that it's sustainable?
Well, listen, certainly the benefit system exists to support those that are genuinely in need, and for those that are genuinely in need, they deserve the support of the state, but that needs to be coupled with a system that taxpayers can be absolutely confident will be able to discriminate between those that are in need and those that may just need a bit of additional treatment, a bit of additional support, or in rare occasions, but unfortunately on some occasions, actually do need to be told to simply just get out of bed and go to work.
Is that helpful, though? I mean, again, if we look at it as a systemic problem, we know that a lot of the issues are in alcohol abuse, drug abuse, whether that's, again, mental health beforehand or mental health afterwards. We could find ourselves in a position where we're spending much more money than we're paying on PIP. So we're parking people on this benefit, which is expensive, but we could end up spending way more if we try to fix the system. Is that a problem if we spend more but fix the system?
Well, listen, often you have a problem with reform that the pendulum swings too far one way. And you mentioned that we put mental health on parity with physical health. And I think that's something that most people rightly support. I don't think we want to go back to a world in which mental health was seen as something to be embarrassed about, something to be ashamed about, something to be ignored. But, having put that on parity, I now don't think we have a system that sufficiently knows how to deal with people that have relatively mild anxiety, depression or other mental health conditions that may actually be entirely circumstantial. Maybe they've lost their job, maybe they've had a relationship breakdown. And I don't think we have a benefit system that knows how to deal with those people. And that's something that the government now needs to work towards.
The problem is always, though, isn't it, that with change, some people who really need this may lose it. And then you've got a situation where somebody might kill themselves, or there might be some other cost, and that is always the problem, isn't it, when you try to implement changes to a system?
Yeah, but I mean, the problem is if we have perfection as our standard, if we have a standard where every single person is saved by the state, every single problem is caught by the state, if you have perfection as your goal, you will end up having a state that does little other than provide benefits to its citizens. And that is not something that it's not a country that most people want to live in. So listen, we cannot have perfection as the standard. The safety net does need to be there. But at the same time, as I said, if we're aiming for perfection, we're not going to reach anywhere near it. And the cost will be absolutely vast.
Just briefly, are we heading towards a situation where in the future there'll be a universal payment?
Well, listen, this is something that many people have floated, and with artificial intelligence, if artificial intelligence does lead to massive economic growth, but at the same time, massive job displacement because people lose their jobs, then listen, that's something that everybody is going to have to look at. I don't necessarily see huge amounts of evidence that we're heading that way. Every time that there has been these technological innovations, people have adapted. But listen, that is an interesting topic of discussion for sure.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely have that at some point. Thank you very, very much for joining me, Elliot. Elliot Keck, there, Head of Campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance.